Hello everyone, my name's Benjamin Anthony. I'm co-founder of the MirYam Institute.org, the premier international forum for Israel-focused dialogue, discussion and debate. Among the initiatives of which I'm most proud is the annual Israel Strategy and Policy Tour, or ISAP for short. ISAP is the vehicle through which we have the high privilege of bringing cadets from the United States Military Academy at West Point, the U.S. Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, and students from the Virginia Military Institute in Virginia to the State of Israel for a 12-day strategy and policy tour of the country. Now, prior to their arrival in the Jewish state, we bring the cadets to Poland for a 2-day tour of the death camps there in that country. That's where they become acquainted with the horrors of the Holocaust. And as I've mentioned, they then travel onward to see the state of Israel, the people of Israel, and the mutual flourishing of both in real time. The ISAP tour, to be clear, brings future officers of the United States Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps to the one and only Jewish state, and it establishes an unbreakable connection between these future defenders of the great United States of America and the Jewish homeland. But we don't stop there. We follow on and up with these cadets by way of regular briefings back on post in the military academies. I'm delighted to share one of those briefings with you, which was conducted via Zoom, and it features a long-form interview of none other than retired General Stanley McChrystal, formerly commander of the United States Forces in Afghanistan. After my initial interview with General McChrystal, we hand over to the cadets who came on the ISAP tour in 2019, and 3 of those cadets question him, and they are then followed by a further 2 faculty members from the United States Military Academy at West Point. It makes for a fascinating conversation, during the course of which General McChrystal attends to the subjects of the Iranian nuclear threat, America's likely response to that threat, and also to the rising threat emanating from China and the abilities of the United States to curb that threat. General McChrystal also weighs in on the idea of national service in the United States of America, and he also speaks about the idea of leadership writ large and how we can work to uncover that in our younger generation. I hope you enjoy this interview. It's a fascinating discussion with a global leader, and he interacts wonderfully with the future leaders of the United States of America. I also want to thank everybody at jbstv.org for broadcasting this interview, and I want to encourage you, the viewers, to invest in the vital work of jbstv.org via their website. With that, I invite you to enjoy our interview with General Stanley McChrystal. Welcome, one and all, on behalf of the MirYam Institute. We are absolutely delighted and honored to welcome each and every one of you to this installment of the MirYam Institute exclusive speaker series. General Stanley McChrystal is a transformational leader with a remarkable record of achievement. General McChrystal was called one of America's greatest warriors by Secretary of Defense Robert Gates. He is widely praised for launching a revolution in warfare by leading a comprehensive counterterrorism organization that fused intelligence and operations, redefining the way military and government agencies interact. Since retiring from the military, General McChrystal has served on several corporate boards of directors that include Deutsche Bank America, JetBlue Airways, Navistar, Siemens Government Technologies, Fiscal Note, and Accent Technologies. General McChrystal is a passionate advocate for national service, about which I'll be asking him during the course of the interview, and he is the chair of the board of Service Year Alliance, which envisions a future in which a service year is a cultural expectation and opportunity for every young American. He's a senior fellow at Yale University's Jackson Institute for Global Affairs where he teaches a course on leadership. Additionally, he is the author of the best-selling leadership books, My Share of the Task, a memoir, Team of Teams, New Rules for Engagement for a Complex World, and Leaders, Myth, and Reality. General McChrystal founded the McChrystal Group in January 2011, recognizing that companies today are experiencing parallels to what he faced in the war theater. General McChrystal established this advisory services firm to help businesses challenge the hierarchical command and control approach to organizational management. General McChrystal, it's a real privilege for me to be able to interview you. Welcome to the MirYam Institute, and thank you in advance of your time.
Benjamin, my honor. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. So I'd like to begin really by talking to you about something that I was shocked by. You know, an individual with your achievements gathers and garners many a legend along the way throughout their course of service, but there's one legend that I really had trouble digesting, pun intended, and that's this idea of eating just one meal a day, General McChrystal. Is that true? Is it false? How on earth did that habit come about, if it actually is the truth?
No, it's absolutely true, and it's still true. And everybody thinks it's some Zen thing. Actually, when I was a lieutenant, I thought I was starting to get fat. And so I really began running as a hobby, and I went to one meal a day, and I eat dinner. Now, you got to understand, I eat everything I can reach at dinner. And so I'm not sure it's good for your health, but I've been doing it for 40 years. So if I change now, it could hurt me.
Well, I thank you for letting us know. It's not a habit that I will emulate, but it is certainly that I'm sure there will be many other habits during the course of this call and many other principles that you'll impart unto us that I will be sure to emulate and to look to pay forward as well. So I'd like to begin, General, with a quick question. In fact, I'm going to take you up on your kind offer for me to call you Stan, if that's okay.
Please.
So Stan, you began, I'd like to talk first of all about the notion of unpopular wars and what they might, how they might impact upon the drafting of the best and the brightest into the militaries. So you, for example, began your military service, I believe it was right after the conclusion of the Vietnam War. And that war ultimately was viewed as unpopular. It was viewed as unpopular by many of the American service personnel and much of the American citizenry. I happen to be a combat veteran, Stan, of the Second Lebanon War of 2006, which was also deemed a very unpopular war by many of Israel's service personnel and citizens. But in Israel, regardless of the popularity of a given campaign, the national conscription model means that year on year, war after war, generation after generation, the military has the luxury of drafting the very best and the brightest and the most dedicated from among its citizenry. And it also has the opportunity to convince, doesn't always work, but to convince the best and the brightest of each draft to sign more time and to commit to a life of service within the military, extended beyond the requisite draft. Now, that dynamic is not at play in the United States of America. And I'd like you to talk about how an unpopular war or a war that wanes and ebbs and flows in popularity, for example, like in Iraq War or the war in Afghanistan, how that impacts upon the military's ability to continue to bring the best and the brightest into its ranks, if you would.
Of course, Benjamin. And I'm going to go back and give a little bit of a history review to do that. We start maybe with World War II as an experience by the United States. Of course, 16 million people in uniform, every family touched, pretty much unanimity on the need to fight the war. But it was also had a beginning and a middle and end that was pretty straightforward. We go forward to two things happen at once. The Cold War began, and that was sort of in the backdrop. And we had a draft throughout the Cold War. But then, of course, the Korean War, which was very unpopular. The further we get from it, sometimes the less we understand just how unpopular it was in the United States. And so we had this idea that going to war far away for an objective that was less clear than many Americans viewed World War II, for example, was hard to stomach. We came into the Vietnam War where my father fought 2 tours and my brother fought. And that war had two issues to it. First was it wasn't very popular because the nature of the war, although it was first cast as part of the Cold War and then cast as defending South Vietnam or helping South Vietnam defend itself, Americans get very frustrated by a lack of clear progress or the idea that America can win and will win, sort of impatient people. And then we had a parallel issue that we ran a draft that was incredibly unfair. It was very much skewed to people who couldn't find a way to avoid it, either through marriage or through education or through whatnot. In fact, there's some extraordinary statistics during the entire Vietnam War. Not a single son or daughter of a serving member of Congress was killed. And yet something like 150 sons and daughters of general officers on active service were killed. And so what happens in the officer corps, you started this tradition of daughters and sons following fathers and going that way. But in the enlisted ranks, it was very much a certain number of volunteers, but other people who couldn't avoid the draft. So it was viewed as an unfair experience. We created the volunteer army after Vietnam, just as I was entering the military. There were still draftees serving, but the culture of the force changed. In many ways, it was a wonderful experience because everybody wanted to be there. The problem with that was much of America isn't there. There are zip codes in parts of America that literally are almost never represented in the military. There are certain spikes after 9/11 and whatnot. Mm-hmm. But if you look at a map of where America's enlisted force comes from, it comes geographically very focused in certain areas in the South and the Midwest and whatnot. That's inherently unhealthy for a cause because you've got a force. I'm not going to call it a mercenary force because it's not that, but nor is it representative of the nation. Not everyone is invested in the outcome of the conflict, and not everybody, therefore, understands it as well as they should. And particularly when the conflict drags on and it's difficult. Now, in Iraq and Afghanistan, unlike with the Vietnam experience, the American people didn't assign blame for the war to the warrior. In the Vietnam War, people were spit on as they came home. They went to airports. I mean, it was difficult to believe. I was a young junior high and high school student, but it was extraordinary. Now, there were some things like the My Lai massacre and others that undercut belief, but the average service member went over, served honorably and bravely, came home and was treated poorly. And treated poorly almost to this day. That didn't happen with Afghanistan and Iraq. Largely people, even those who opposed the war, made the decision that they wouldn't focus that frustration on the military. So the military's been put a bit on a pedestal. And sometimes I warn people, be careful, because the pedestal is not a comfortable place to be. We should be on an even level with the rest of society, because the military should be a part of society, not a separate entity. And so, two observations on this. First, when I commanded in Afghanistan and Iraq, I would fly around to bases and I would land at these little bases, and there'd be 30 or 40 Americans and a like number of Afghans or Iraqis. And invariably, one of the young lieutenant or captain or senior NCO would be the son or daughter of someone I was serving with, invariably. And that was kind of fun because you hug them, you knew them in high school, that sort of thing. But then you realize what we have is a very small group of people and their offspring basically populating the force. That's not a healthy thing. You need, again, to have people from across the nation. And as the war gets difficult, the danger is that the military becomes more insular, that the military starts to think, well, we're fighting this war, no one understands us, and the press is screwing us, or any number of things. And once the military starts to feel self-righteous, and if you look at countries where the military, and I've been to many countries where the military will say, we are the one part of this society that believes in our nation, that are honest, that protect democracy. And too often those militaries then seize control because they think they have a moral, either obligation or authority to do that. And that's the danger of this. So the military, in my view, particularly if you're going to fight difficult wars, need to be literally cut from the fabric of the nation. Everybody's family should be at risk if we're going to make a decision to do military operations. Sorry to go on so long, Benjamin. Thanks.
No, I very much appreciate that answer. And I can already see from that answer there are going to be numerous follow-up questions that I'm not going to have the opportunity to ask you. But one that does actually lead on very, very nicely from that, and one that's close to my heart and to the heart of the MirYam Institute altogether, is the idea of national service general, though not necessarily by way of the military. Now, the state of Israel, again, has a system, as you know very well, of national service, the majority of which revolves around the military, but it's by no means exclusive to military service. So conscientious objectors might find work to undertake in a civil capacity, in a civic capacity elsewhere. The same with very religious members of Israeli society. But you believe very, very strongly in the virtue of national service. And what I would like to know is why you believe it to be a viable suggestion in the United States of America, because I, for example, am extremely supportive of an answer like that. And I've read your comments on the notion of expected, though not compulsory service, which I think is a very, very interesting description I'd like you to speak to. But I'd like you also to talk to us about that description and why you feel national service can help to bridge divides that run throughout the United States of America, as in many other societies indeed, and why national service can enable a participant to at once engage in a cause dear to their hearts, while also avoiding the pitfalls of creating even greater separation between themselves and their peers. An example of that actually is couched in the answer to the previous question. So, for example, military service is an aspect of national service. It's venerated by most, criticized by others. But one of the aspects of military service is that it certainly, I would say certainly, creates a community that is distinct from the broader community throughout the United States of America. So how would national service actually help to avoid that quandary, while also giving the participant the opportunity to engage in something to which they feel a strong passion and purpose?
No, thanks, Benjamin. I appreciate bringing it up. First off, for those who aren't aware of what I believe, I think every young American should do 1 year of paid national service. Some people would go military, some would do it conservation, healthcare. There's a whole constellation of opportunities, and more need to be given. The reason it needs to be a year of full time is you need to be all in. It needs to be inconvenient. It needs to pull you out of your world, put you there. It needs to be paid because right now the average people who do it are from upper middle class families, and they're female, white females. And that's because a lot of people can't afford to be supported by their family or whatever during that year. So we need to make it a living stipend for everyone, and therefore it's absolutely equal. Now, I'll go on and put the mandatory versus voluntary on the table. When I fantasize at night, I get in a room by myself in the dark, I fantasize about mandatory national service. So were I the king, that's the way it would be. But every time you ask any group of Americans, whether they're older Americans who wouldn't do it or young Americans, if you put the name or the term mandatory next to it, support for it drops off dramatically. Mm-hmm. And so what I'd like to do is make it culturally expected. And the way I describe is, you're one of those people, you never want to go to a cocktail party and someone says, Sarah Martin, where did you serve? And you have to answer, or you run for Congress and someone says, what'd you do? And you don't have an answer. So I do think when we get to a certain critical mass, you could get to that cultural expectation where people, even who weren't excited to do it, would do it because they just felt like they had to. And that's, of course, important. Now, why do I believe it's so important? First off, a nation is not something, I know some people agree, God did not create the United States of America. He didn't draw the boundaries and say, this is the United States, you all Americans. A nation is a covenant between the citizens of that nation. It's an agreement to form a partnership with other people. It says, we'll take care of each other. We'll defend each other. We'll look out for each other. With that, we get certain rights. We get privileges. We get things that come with that. But with that, those inalienable rights, we get inalienable responsibilities. And I think they're further than just fighting in a world war, and they're further than just voting or paying your taxes. They are being a part of the society and contributing and taking care of other, in our case, Americans. But where do you learn that? You learn it through experience, sometimes through your parents, sometimes through your own. But what I would argue is whenever you have to invest in something, if you ever have to go pick up trash on a highway, you feel different about littering afterward. It's just the way it is. We all like children, but we like our own kids a lot more than we like other people's because we're responsible. So how do we create this sense of responsibility to the nation and to other Americans? And that's through an experience. And I would say create these experiences where you pull people from different zip codes together, different parts of America, because right now we have a tendency to live with people in our income level, of our race, of our religion, of our, any number of groupings. We really don't get out of it on a daily basis that much. Those of you who are in the military are going to be fortunate because the platoons and companies you're in are going to be much more of a mixture. But in today's volunteer army, even they will be far less representative than they would have been 50 years ago or during World War II. So how do we create that? And if we can create that shared experience, you suddenly find this phenomenon that who do you not like? You typically don't like people you don't know or people you think don't like you. Once you really get to know any group, when I got up close to Afghans for many years or Iraqis, then my attitude toward them completely changed because they're people and they've got perspectives that are just as good as mine. So I think national service could be the way we get there. We are so divided as a nation, so partisan right now and increasingly vitriolic about it. If we can't create those shared experiences where we can create that sense of bonding and responsibility, I think we'll have even more problems in the years ahead. And that's why I care so much about it. Thank you.
And I know that your conversation with the Biden administration or the incoming Biden administration focused on matters of national security and international strategy. But have you had an opportunity to moot this idea of required paid national service for 1 year? Is there appetite in the current administration for that?
Yeah, it's great. Thanks for asking that, too. We have been this got popular again about 1960. So about 60 years ago, this, with the rise of the Peace Corps and whatnot, we started to make, and then it's waxed and waned over years. To be honest, in the last 20 some years, Bill Clinton supported it to a degree. President George W. Bush supported it, but we could never achieve orbit. We got to about 250,000 slots in the Serve America Act. Believe it or not, both the pandemic in its own negative way and the new administration give us great opportunity. There's now renewed excitement. Senator Coons from Delaware is pushing, the CORE Act right now. And if that gets through, we're going to get to another level, a much expanded level. And then I think we've got an opportunity to get it into our society as a regular long-term thing. So I'm optimistic.
Well, I certainly wish you every possible success with that initiative. It's extremely virtuous, very important, and I hope that it does actually launch in the coming years on the scale and size that you'd anticipate and hope for. But let's turn for a moment, Stan, to some military matters. In a recent interview that I read, you mentioned that the war in Afghanistan would be resolved by way of an evolution. Not a quick victory and not a quick loss, but an evolution. Now, what I'd like to know is whether or not you feel that's inevitably the case for democracies or law-abiding states when in conflict with non-state actors or terror organizations, for example. To take that a little bit further and to bring it home to my country, the state of Israel, there we regularly come into conflict with terror organizations with whom we share a border. So these organizations are not in distant lands. We share a border with them. We have, for example, Hezbollah to the north and Hamas to the south. And because of the proximity of the threat, I would argue that a resolution through evolution is not a policy that's acceptable or perhaps palatable or tenable for the citizens or the soldiers of Israel. But I do want to say that I'm actually a minority voice when it comes to that opinion. Now, do you feel, to come back to the beginning of my question, that resolution by evolution is the only reasonable outcome to be expected when combating non-state actors, or are you speaking specifically in the case of Afghanistan?
Yeah, that is a really thoughtful question, Benjamin. And I'm not sure of my answer. I'm going to tell you my reaction to it because I thought a lot about that question, but I'm not confident that I'm right. I went to the northern border of Israel about 2 weeks after you fought your war in 2006. And then I went down to Gaza and stood out there and with the division commanders in both locations, and we talked about it. And we talked about the term mowing the grass, yes, which you'd be very familiar with. And what that really means is the grass grows, the threat rises, and you mow it. And what happens is there's still grass under there. There's still soil, water, sun. And so the grass is going to grow again unless you do something about it. I would say that in many cases, like Afghanistan, for one, you have a Taliban opposition to essentially a Northern Alliance controlled government that is neither side strong enough to win outright. And they've yinged and yang back and forth a couple of times. And they have not been able to come together and form a viable government that the people have trust in, that is not corrupt, so corrupt that it guarantees the other side, the opposition, is always going to have fertile ground to go in. Clearly, I would have loved to see a quick victory there and then Afghanistan move forward. But that's why I talk about evolution. What's going to happen is, in the case of Afghanistan, the people are just going to determine what's livable. Now, this may take quite a long time, actually. I don't think the Taliban, if they are able to come back, can take the whole country because there are parts in the north where the Tajiks and others just won't lose because it's their survival. And similarly, it's hard to eradicate the reason for the Pashtun-dominated Taliban. So it gets back to, unless you get to the root cause of the problem, I remember people talking about IEDs, improvised explosive devices. What do you do about it? The first thing we did in Iraq was we started bolting armor on unarmored vehicles. All right. Then we got really clever and we started putting jammers on our vehicles so that we would jam the signals that they were using to set off the IEDs. We thought we were clever. And then they used light beams, optically done. And we put these arms on the front of our vehicles to trigger them early and do them. But you never solve the problem unless you get at why they're replacing IEDs. Why are they building them in place? And what's the reason? What's the motivation? And if you can't address that, all you're going to do is be in a tactical seesaw. Now, nobody likes that, because if somebody hears we have a terrorist problem or if we have an insurgent problem, and if I was to stand on the stage against, in front of a group of average Americans, and I was to answer the question and say, we're going to go kick their ass, we're going to do X, we're going to solve that problem, people would cheer. Mm-hmm. If I said, it's probably going to take a generation and a half, we're going to have to put money into this, we're going to have to build this, we're going to have to do education, we're going to do so-and-so, I don't think I'd get an enthusiastic response. But I'm convinced that's the only solution to the problem. I spent much of my life in counterterrorism, and during a period of my service, we were in the highest intensity counterterrorist fight in America's history. And for 5 years, I led that. And the amount of bloodshed was extraordinary. But even in the moment, I told people, we're not winning this fight. All we're doing is giving time and space till other people with other forces can change the dynamics. We can keep, the barbarians away from the gate for that period, but it's going to be very, a bloody affair. Now, that was necessary, and I believe today that was critical, essential to do. But it wasn't a fix. We weren't curing the disease. We were just dealing with, symptoms in the moment, in my personal opinion.
Thank you. And I very much appreciate somebody of your stature and experience saying, I'm not sure that I know the answer. We don't readily hear that, not as frequently as I would like. So thank you again for your candor. For the remainder of my time, I'm going to try and get 3 questions out in the next 10 to 12 minutes with you, Stan, if that's okay. I want to try and place Israel and its relationship with the United States of America, particularly in a military sense or in a defense sense, if you like, on the front burner. So let's begin by talking a bit about the move or the redesignation of the State of Israel from being under the U Command, the European Command, over to Central Command. Israel moved into CENTCOM from EUCOM. Now, I'd like to know what, in your view, is the reason for that. What's the virtue of that? But I'd particularly be grateful if you could apply your answer to the Abraham Accords and speak to how those may have facilitated this adjustment and what the virtuous outcomes of that adjustment are likely to be.
Okay. Just history. I was always taught that Europe EUCOM was responsible for Israel because it was very awkward to have the EUCOM commander or to have the Central Command commander go to Egypt, go to Saudi Arabia, and then go to Israel. So the idea was to carve Israel out and have another U.S. commander deal with them so you don't have the same person building relationships, making friends, flying airplanes from one to the other. I sort of get that. At the same time, that's not recognizing the reality of where Israel actually sits. Right. And if you look at the problem set of stability in the region, Israel's security and whatnot, whenever you divide a problem in pieces, then nobody owns it. You get an incomplete response to it. And so I think the idea of moving Israel back geographically or in command and control wise makes sense. I think that we have got to look at security the United States, have got to look at security in the region holistically. We have in the past and we will in the future, and that irritates all the participants. Because if you take a big view in 1947 and then 48, when the United States leaned forward and recognized Israel as a state, immediately parts of the Islamic Arab world turned on the United States, and our stature with them changed significantly. We had been in a special place because we weren't the British and we weren't the French. We just didn't have that colonial legacy, so people didn't hate us for that. So as a consequence, we got oil deals, we got all kinds of stuff in the 30s. And then once we recognized Israel as a state, that changed it. People suddenly said, okay, we know what you really are. And so it changed the dynamic. For the worse, obviously, because when you have a harder dynamic, you have less influence, it's harder to work things. So the United States has got to look holistically, which means we're always going to do less than Israel wants and less than our Arab neighbor or our other Arab allies want, because we'll be trying to do a balancing act. We'll be trying to get people to the table and whatnot. That can feel very frustrating sometimes, because when I was a young person, I remember the 67 war I was in 7th grade. And then when I was at West Point, we came in one day and the October 73 war had erupted. And I mean, there's no getting around it that the sympathy, the automatic connection was with the Israelis for lots of reasons. But the reality was, when you have a situation like that in the region, if you can't think long-term and holistically, unless one side is going to be wiped out and done away with, you're going to have to figure out solutions to the problem. And so I think that things like the Abraham Accords, the move to normalization are good. I think that there's been a big move on the part of many of the Islamic states in recognizing the reality of Israel. And I won't even say that, whether they like it or not. That is the reality. There is a state of Israel. It is stable. It's not going anywhere. I sometimes describe it to people. It's like the rock in the shoe of that region. Whenever they walk, they're reminded it's there, which is irritating to a lot of people, as you know. But I think the longer you go and people accept certain things as realities, then you can move to something maybe more stable, maybe more long-term. And of course, that's, you never go back to what I said about insurgencies. You're never going to solve any problem as long as the root cause of the problem is there. It will come back in different manifestations. So I think there's room for continued evolution. Sorry to take so long, Benjamin. I know you're trying to go faster. It's me.
No. This is very important. And I will curtail my questions in order to give platforms, especially to the cadets in just a moment. An ultimate question for you. You, again, are somebody who's been advising the administration. I believe, I don't know if that's in an ongoing capacity. I know it certainly was a very important role during the course of the transition. And of course, you have a history with the administration. So could you tell us how strong the resolve is of this administration, the Biden-Harris administration, to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon? And do you feel that they will pursue their strategy by way of negotiations, re-entry into the JCPOA, or do you think there may be other means brought to bear?
Yeah, I have not spoken to the administration about this issue, so I don't have direct knowledge, so I can't speak for it. I will give my guess based upon knowing President Biden from before, knowing his role, knowing General Austin or Secretary Austin and whatnot. I think two things are going to happen. I think one is there's going to, of course, be an effort to bring back the Accords with a very real objective of preventing Iran from becoming a nuclear armed power. I think they will lean hard into that. And I think they will also lean hard into trying to curtail Iran's other activities in the region, which are very much not helpful. Some of the things they do are almost acts of war. And so there's a frustration there. Now, if you step back, though, and I am now guessing what people think back in the back of their minds, I'm not sure, stopping Iran from producing nuclear weapons is increasingly problematic. If they really wanted to do that, I'm not sure we could do it within acceptable limits, i.e. the military action it would take to do that, because they've spread their nuclear capacity out to a number of locations. They have the expertise and all like this. If they really wanted to get nuclear weapons, and they wanted to even advertise the fact that they had them, I'm convinced, short of a full invasion of Iran, that you probably couldn't stop them. So the only way to stop them is to convince them that as members of the world order, they are more advantaged to not have them than to have them. Mm-hmm. That's a tough sell because, every nation that has nuclear weapons gets more respect than one that doesn't. It's just the reality of it. I mean, we claim it wasn't that way, but if I were an Iranian, I would want nuclear weapons. If I were an Iranian, I would pursue that policy because once I had them, they would be treated differently. So, therein lies the challenge. But it's possible that Iran could be convinced that economically and politically that it is the price of attaining nuclear weapons and at least being a publicly nuclear armed member isn't worth it. But I give that a less than 50% chance. I just think that they will push ahead to get them. And at some point, we will all have to just live with that new reality.
Thank you, Stan. In a moment, I'm going to ask for our first cadet to ask a question. That will be Cadet Travis. Alan, if you could have Cadet Travis at the ready. Stan, I want to finish my part of the interview with a question of you. It goes back to a seminal moment in terms of popular culture and many of us learning about even more about you than we already knew by way of your military career. And that's the Rolling Stone interview. And I'll tell you why I'm asking it. We live in an era of cancel culture. People just go away because of something they've said or something they're said to have said. Even in the Bible, and I don't say this with a particularly religious fervor, but I remember from the teachings of my father and of my mother that there's a point at which God is said to be about to eliminate the people of Israel. And Moses turns around and says, if that is to happen, blot out my name. And in the following weekly portion of the Bible, his name is actually not mentioned, I believe. I believe I've got the chronology correct. In other words, it's such a sensitive issue to remove a person's personality that even if you say it in defense of something great, you're punished for doing so. Now, you gave this Rolling Stone interview. You have not gone away, far from it. You have shown your actions after that to be an incredible example of forgiveness, of also self-forgiveness, and you've also forged this wonderful, enduring relationship with President Biden. And I wanted to ask you to speak on that, about how an error of judgment or even exposing oneself to a mischaracterization or an accurate characterization of what's said is something that you can come back from, you can own, and you can proceed from. And I specifically wanted to do that with the cadets on the line because, let's face it, no cadet is ever going to ask a general of your stature that question. So could you talk to us about it?
Yeah, no, Benjamin, thanks for the question and the way you asked it. Just for those who may not be aware, in June 2010, an article came out in the Rolling Stone magazine, which in the course of about 36 hours led to me offering my resignation to President Obama and accepting it. Now, what had happened was we did a lot of press because I felt like we had to try to build war. And this freelance reporter writing for the Rolling Stone came over and he spent time with us. He didn't spend a lot of time. It wasn't like he was embedded for weeks. He was with us for a couple of 2-3 day sessions and very little time with me personally, but in the staff one, but he was there. He wrote an article that we thought was going to be a puff piece about, the camaraderie of this team that had been to war together for so long. In fact, he came to Paris, where I'd been asked to go meet with military and political leadership to build up support for the war. My wife was there. And so he came to this bar where my staff had gathered. They'd asked my wife and I to come. And he saw us drink beer and talk afterward. And as we walked back to the hotel, my wife said, I'm really glad the reporter was there because he saw you guys as the team you are. We were a German officer, an Afghan officer, a couple of Brit officers, a French Foreign Legionnaire. It was about 10 of us that were my personal staff. And of course, when the article came out, that was portrayed as this drunken brawl thing. I mean, my wife was there. So anyway, so the article was different than I think the reality was, but that doesn't matter because the article comes out and it creates this perceived pressure between the military who doesn't respect the administration, the civilian administration not. And guess what? It's my responsibility. Even if I think the article is not accurate or fair, it's certainly not fair for the President of the United States suddenly to have this kind of problem, political and PR problem, thrown on his desk by one of his commanding officers. So it's my issue. So I am asked to fly back to the United States. I had already prepared my resignation, went into the president, and he was wonderful. He said, what happened? And I said, I really don't know. I mean, I haven't done investigation. However, I do know the article came out, and so here's my resignation. If you want it, take it, and I will never be bitter about it. If you don't want to take it, you want to tell me to shut up and go back and keep working, I'll do that too. What do you want? And he says, it hurts me, but I'm going to accept it. Now, I had been in the Army for 34 years as an officer at that point. I'd been at 4 years, West Point before that. I'd been an Army brat before that. I was born in an Army hospital. I'd never not been a soldier in my mind, either a future soldier or a soldier. And in an instant, I'm not. I mean, literally in an instant. And not only am I not in the military anymore, I'm on the ticker of the TV every 30 seconds for, as long as a story lasts 2 or 3 days. And I've got pundits opining about what a bad guy I am. Some people who know nothing about it, but, they're they're going to give an opinion anyway. My 86-year-old father's watching this at home, retired general. My son, who's a college student, is subjected to this. And my wife, who I'd been married to at that point for almost 34 years, who had been with me from cadet on, suddenly it's all gone. So I go home from the White House, literally straight to Fort McNair, because I'd flown from Pakistan or from Afghanistan, and she was living in quarters at McNair. And I go into the quarters, and Annie didn't think that this was going to happen. She'd been told by the chief chairman that the president would not accept it. Whatever. I walked in and I told her it's all over. I resigned. And she looked at me and she said, "Good. We've always been happy and we'll always be happy." And maybe that's the pivotal moment of the rest of my life, because from that moment on, with her sort of guidance and help, I had two ways I could have gone. I could have been an aggrieved, bitter old general. I could have spent the rest of my life relitigating that, saying the article was unfair. You know, I could have done any of that stuff. Or I could not. I could just accept that what's happened, and we could go forward. And that's what we did. And we didn't sit down and say, we're going to go forward. She just signaled that. And then from that moment on, I decided that what I was going to do was I was going to try to conduct myself in the future in a way so that anyone who had met me or who had worked for me before, had placed their faith in me, felt like, okay, that article was an aberration. I was right to have believed in it. And those people who'd never met me before and met me for the first time and were expecting something because what they'd seen in the article, they would meet something else and they go, well, that's not congruent with that depiction. And that was the best I could do. And I would never worry about the article. I mean, does it hurt inside? Yeah, it still hurts. 11 years later, still hurts. Now, it hurts a little less every year because nobody ever wants an asterisk next to their name. You know, every time I'm introduced or written about in an article, somebody's got to put some allusion to that. He was a successful general until, you know, nobody likes that. But the reality was, by facing forward, it did two things. One, it caused me to focus on things I could control in the future and care about those. And it reminded me, it retaught me some humility. I had gone up for promotion to major when I was a captain, and I was a hotshot captain, and I was considered below the zone, and I didn't make it. And I wasn't hurt until I saw that most of my friends had made it below the zone. And so I felt like, the Army's unfair, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it was a great lesson early in my career that, you know, guess what? Wake up here. This was a much bigger lesson later in my life that said, you're going to fail. Everybody's going to fail. You're going to get divorced. You're going to do something that isn't the way you planned it. And how you react to it is your call. You control that. You can't even control what people write about you. You can't rewrite the history books, but you can control how you act. And I think that's the best decision I ever made. It's the best choice of a course. And of course, it's worked out magically. My life ever since I left the service has been just lucky after lucky after lucky. I mean, I'm on here today. So, you know, I can't complain about anything. But, you know, I'm not saying I wish that had happened. I'm saying I'm glad that I learned the lessons that have worked out for me.
Thank you, Stan. It's been a real privilege for me to interview you, and thanks for dealing with that subject so candidly. I'm now very pleased for the balance of our time, and I know you have a hard stop at quarter after the hour, but for the balance of our time, let's get the cadets to speak to you. They're all ISAP alumni. They were with us in Poland and in Israel in 2019. And we're very proud and privileged to have them with us today. And I'd like to begin, if I could, with the question from Kevin Moore. Kevin, the floor is yours. It's wonderful to see you again.
So, sir, my question was kind of revolving around society today in the United States. So, as you may have heard, all cadets are now required to take a course on officership at the Academy, in which we kind of discussed the many challenges of being a commissioned leader in the 21st century. One of our recent discussions centered around the balance between conservatism and liberalism in the Army, not in the political sense, but in valuing tradition versus transformation of the Army. So in today's environment of social change, how should the Army balance its conservative tendencies, its traditional tendencies that have given it stability with the desire and need for social change in various respects? And what advice would you give to young officers, soldiers, and even civilian leaders in leading the nation and the Army through these challenges?
Now, I know why you're a star, man, Kevin. Really thoughtful question. Here's what I think, and I've been doing a lot of work kind of adjacent to this over the last few years, and here's where I come down. You're right. The military, if we take, conservative and whatnot, not to mean political, mean to be, sort of adhere to tradition and whatnot. The military, you're right, is extraordinarily conservative. There was a move to bring back the horse cavalry after the Great War. And you laugh and you go, well, after World War I, the horse cavalry was dead. Actually, it was World War II. There were and I got my grandfather's cavalry saber in a case right behind me here, but they actually tried to bring it back after World War II. The military has this, you're not even aware of how conservative the certain parts of the values are. It's muscle memory that pulls back to things. And you felt it at West Point, but you thought it was just West Point. It's not. It's the military. It is people who want to go back to Sherman tanks if they could, because, hey, they run good. So what I think you got to do is hold on to one, and then the military's got to get far more flexible, dramatically more adaptable. One of the dangers of doctrine, and I'm going to sound like, a heretic here, is doctrine offers the opportunity for a solution to the problem. And we created an entire generation when I was a captain on up that went to the National Training Center. And if they followed doctrine, even if they lost the battle, everybody said, all right, well, all right, the OPFOR is very good, but you followed doctrine, so you're good to go. What we should have said is if you lose, you're screwed. As long as you don't do anything illegal or immoral, the only doctrine is winning, solving the problem. Now, you'll find that doctrine can be a guide on things we know that have worked in the past, etc. But you don't perform doctrine and then see how it comes out. You solve the problem, and if doctrine is useful, use it. If it's not, create new doctrine.
Thank you very much, Stan. Our final question is Major Sarah Martin. Sarah, you have the floor.
Sir, thank you for being here with us. I'm Major Martin. I teach in the Department of Social Sciences. And my question concerns Israeli-U.S. partnerships. Given your background in unconventional warfare and unconventional thinking, do you believe there are areas of increased opportunity for U.S.-Israeli partnership, whether those are public-private partnerships or within a whole-of-government approach to solving common problems? And this could take many directions, but one example that comes to mind is Israel's unique expertise in cybersecurity.
Yeah, I think there have to be. And this is the case where, heretofore, we've always had to walk this incredible balancing act, because if your partnerships with Israel are too strong, other nations complain about it and whatnot. I think we need to be unabashed about, Israel is going to be one of our allies, a very important ally. And we are going to have other allies too. Now, we won't agree with all of Israel's positions, but the partnership needs to be strong. I think that Israel's got a number of advantages. Right after I took command of Joint Special Operations Command, I went to Israel. I went first to the region and checked on the forces, and I went to Israel because I wanted to learn things that they had been doing. Some of those were tactical, some of them were higher level things. And we developed a very low key, under the radar screen, but very deep relationship on all things counterterrorism. So I think the answer is what we've got to do is leverage Israel's success and their agility in things like cyber, because there are a tremendous number of things that have come out of cyber organizations in Israel, and I'm staying in contact with some of them. that the United States can benefit from, and vice versa. And this is where it's got to be open. I mean, people have got to see it. It's got to, the world's got to sort of accept it. This is what we do. This is a relationship we're going to have. It shouldn't have to be in back alleys and a lot of business things aren't, but it has to be upfront, and all of our allies of different political persuasions have got to buy into that. And this is where American politics get tricky. You lean too far, people yell at you one way, lean too far the other. And I just think that consistency in American policy in this regard is of value.
Thank you very much, Stan, for being so gracious with your time. One of the things that I would like our listeners to know and to remember is that we have cadets on this call who came to death camps in Poland. Death camps very similar to those visited by those cadets were liberated by troops wearing the uniform, General, that you wore for so many years. And it's the same uniform that those cadets will, in time, in a very short period of time, be wearing. That uniform, to our people, the Jewish people, to me, even as one individual, is synonymous with benevolence to a people that have been torn apart by way of the ravages of the Holocaust, that has been supportive of our state, the one and only Jewish state, the state of Israel, that has been kind to its community of Jews within its own borders. American Jewry has thrived within United States society in a way that was not replicated in Europe, for example. And I want you to know that we are deeply grateful to you for all of the service that you have undertaken, for all of your time here today, and for all that service is in the cause of, namely building a better, greater society with the United States of America at the helm. And I do hope that it will continue to hold that position. General, on behalf of Rosita Panini, on behalf of Alan Langer, my colleague, and on behalf of all of our listeners today, thank you so very much for being with us. May you go from strength to strength. May the cadets go from strength to strength. And also, may I say, it may not yet be the end of your public service to your country. And I hope that you will continue to engage. Thank you so very much, Stan. We're grateful.
Thank you so much. And I wish everybody the best. To Captain Singh and Major Martin, thanks for developing cadets. Thanks for making the future better than it would otherwise be.
Thank you so much.
Take care, y'all.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.